All right, thanks for making Locked On Nets your first listen of the day. We're coming at you free on all podcast platforms. Also, this episode of Locked On Nets is brought to you by McDonald's, proudly serving communities since 1965. McDonald's has always been more than just a place to get tasty, affordable food. It's an unofficial community center. A big thank you to our friends at McDonald's for always being there. I'm loving it. All right, we got a solo podcast coming at you here today on a Friday, previewing the Nets versus the Sixers and Joel Embiid, second game of the season. Lot to talk about here. A lot to talk about a guy, specifically Embiid, that's given the Nets a lot of problems over the years. Could continue to do so here on Friday. Talk about what rotations we could see, what to sort of expect from the Nets, and how this game might set a tone for how the Nets look to play out this season. And I don't mean that they're just going to choose their spots and who they started, but just how they could begin to roll things in terms of the rest of the season with lineups, rotations, starters, all that stuff. We're going to get into it all, but first, the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Brooklyn, yo. All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Doug Norrie. Here by my lonesome without Adam Armbrecht today, flying solo on a Friday podcast. It's all good. I'm going to get you talking about the game coming up against the 76ers. Give me a follow over at Doug Norrie on Twitter. Also, can give a DFSR a follow. That's where I'm doing basketball projections every single day for every single team throughout the season. If you're into FanDuel or DraftKings, go over to DFSR.com. Wanted to get into a Friday podcast talking about what to expect here from the Nets as they host. Excuse me, they don't host. They go into Philadelphia to play the Sixers. The Nets kind of run a little bad here on the beginning to the season in terms of who they have to play. Obviously, have to play the first game against the defending champion Milwaukee Bucks, who basically ran them out of the gym in the first one, and then have to go and play the Sixers, a team that they've notoriously had issues with in the past, and frankly, it's looking like they might have some issues with again. So not exactly an ideal way to onboard some of the new guys that the Nets have brought in when you have to face two teams that are not only pretty established at this point, especially in terms of the regular season. Obviously, we know what the Bucks did, and also really just good on defense. That can be a tough sell early in the season, and so the Nets having to run into both these teams to start, a little unlucky, but what are you going to do? The scheduling gods kind of start to even things out in the next couple games against Charlotte and Washington, although those two teams looked pretty energetic, at least in the first two games, in the games that I watched of each of them on Wednesday. So those might not be total rollover games that the Nets maybe would have had in the past. But regardless, they get Philadelphia on Thursday. They get Philadelphia on Friday in a matchup that could offer the Nets some issues. So let's go through what possibly is a problem here, things that the Nets kind of need to sort out, stuff that would be carryover from the first game, which we went through. If you want to go back and listen to our thoughts on the Milwaukee game, the last two episodes, we really did that in length. The first one, we did a post-game reaction talking about some of the different stuff that happened just from a high level. Then on Thursday's podcast, we got into just some of the rotational stuff that the Nets threw out there, which, frankly, Adam and I were a little confused about. I think the team, they're in a spot right now where I think they can afford to experiment a little bit. They're going to need to experiment with rotations and bigs and who is playing where and who's doing what for this team. So I think a lot of this is to be expected in terms of uncertainty around the Nets, at least for the short term. I think that we're just going to see lots of different lineups. We're going to see lots of different pairings around, I'm going to call it like the 4 and the 5 position, the power forward and center, essentially those positions, just because I just think the Nets aren't totally, I just don't think they know what's going to work. And I think actually, frankly, it could be something that they do by matchup as well. We talked about last podcast how it seemed like they threw Claxton out there to be part of the starting lineup in order to be able to specifically guard Chris Middleton. I don't know if that's going to be something that they do in this game when they face a totally different animal in the 76ers when it comes to Joel Embiid. So as we start to look at the beginning, or excuse me, as we start to look at how this game could possibly take shape, this is the 76ers hosting the Nets, get to look back at some historical stuff that has happened when the Nets have played Joel Embiid in the past. One of the levels or points of consternation among Nets fans for a long time has been the team's lack of size at times and their ability to guard highly skilled, huge centers in the league. Embiid is the prime example of this. He is maybe the best center in the league. He or Jokic, he's the best true center in the league. Jokic is a center for sure, but is more of a sort of like a point center. Joel Embiid is more in the mold of a traditional center. Will get into the post a lot. Can obviously stretch the floor, but it's just like a totally singular talent when it comes to trying to match up against him. And the Nets have really struggled with this. It's been not something that's been a secret over the last couple of years, is that when they face Joel Embiid, they can get trucked. Last year, they played the Sixers Embiid was on the court 3 times when the Sixers played the Nets. He played 31 minutes a game. He averaged 31 points and 11 rebounds. The Nets really had no answer for him. He shot 40% from 3. He got to the line 10 times a game, which for him is like a little lower than normal, but it was mostly because he was just having his way in the post. And we've seen this sort of time and time again. The Nets in the past have kind of had to say, look, Embiid is going to get what he wants. We're just going to need to sort of deal with the other pieces here in terms of what else we're going to be able to stop. If are we going to allow him to just kind of get his? Okay, well by the way, we don't really have a functional way to stop that anyway, so it's just going to need to happen. Can we outscore them on the other end, the Sixers? Can we limit some of the other pieces of their team that are dangerous? And we'll just live with the idea that we cannot stop Joel Embiid. And I think that's going to be the case again here. If we look at earlier in the preseason, the Nets did play the Sixers. That was the second game of the preseason. Now, the Nets rolled out a pretty standard lineup for them, which was the carryover from the season before, and that was the Kevin Durant, James Harden, Joe Harris, and then they played Bruce Brown and Blake Griffin together. And this was just another example of Joel Embiid literally doing whatever he wanted in the time that he was on the court. Embiid in that game only played 8 minutes. He dropped 14 points in 8 minutes, 6 for 8 from the field, was absolutely, utterly unstoppable. Nets had no solution for it. He didn't even really need to get on the boards. On the offensive end, it didn't matter. He just basically made everything. So the boards didn't end up becoming a problem because he only had 1 rebound in the game. But like I said, he only played 8 minutes. And on the offensive end, literally had no issues at all. So this is something that's likely to have carried over into this year. And for all of the moves the Nets made in the offseason, and they made a lot, especially on bolstering some of their, we want to think of it as interior size, this dealing with a guy like Embiid is not really something they addressed. I think that they were ultimately fine with it. The Nets are aware that Joel Embiid exists in the Eastern Conference. It's not like there's this lack of understanding around who the other teams have in terms of superstars and what those guys can do. I think that ultimately the Nets saw their best chance to win around I'll call it the big 3 because that was the plan, at least to start the season. Their best chance to win around the big 3 was to put floor spacers, some sort of athletic-ish size on the interior, get rid of guys like DeAndre Jordan, who were probably just too limited, and kind of get some floor spacers and deal with it that way. And just kind of, at some point, if you have to have a weakness, if their weakness is going to be guarding huge superstar centers, okay, maybe there's 1 or 2 of them in the league at this point, and you just take your lumps when they come. So, but it doesn't solve the problem of what we're going to see on Friday here, which is a team that is, again, underqualified or under-equipped, that's the Nets, to deal with a guy like Joel Embiid. So there's definitely a concern here around their ability to be able to stop him, what they're going to be able to do to generate any defensive stops if the Sixers are totally incentivized to go to Embiid over and over again, which I think they will. And then if they have the firepower to combat that on the other end by just outscoring them and saying, we'll try to limit as many possessions, or maybe try to stop the point of attack, the ball to getting to Embiid in the first place. I think your best chance is ball denial to start, because once he has the ball, you're kind of in trouble, is taking attack like that and then hoping to outscore them on the other end. So I think that's where the Nets will be focused to begin with. But again, that's so much easier said than done, because we've seen it time and time again. It's not like they haven't tried these things in the past. They've tried to stop Joel Embiid in the past. It just really hasn't worked on any level, because over and over again, like I said, he has just put up insane numbers against them, and the short term has been just as evident of that as the same as what he's done over the course of his career. All right, going to get more into this matchup here against Philadelphia. First, this episode of Locked On Nets is brought to you by McDonald's, proudly serving communities since 1965. McDonald's has always been more than just a place to get tasty, affordable food. It's a place where friends and family can come to reconnect. Classmates are going there for study groups. They got the dependable Wi-Fi, underrated coffee as well. You know what's available here at McDonald's. There for the community for all of these decades. Win or lose, is the place where teammates, competitors, home team, away team can come to recharge. Maybe you're stopping off on a road trip. I've been plenty of those. You stop by McDonald's, you know what you're going to get. Every location, super consistent, great for the family. Everything you know you're getting with McDonald's. A big thank you to our friends at McDonald's for always being there. McDonald's, I'm loving it. All right, so there's a piece of the Nets question here. I don't think we kind of discussed that there's going to be very limited opportunity for the Nets to control and stop Joel Embiid. Now, the good news is Joel Embiid's only one player. He's a really great player, top 10 in the league for sure, maybe higher when he's fully on his game. Probably definitely higher than that. Probably went too low with Embiid there. When he's at the top of his game. Again, it's not like the Nets haven't been able to deal with this over time. Embiid specifically is able to fill up the box score for sure, but it's not like these have been these terrible situations for the Nets over the long term. It's just this is just one guy that we tend to focus on because there's a for sure weakness when it comes to playing Embiid, right? So it's easy to sometimes, and I know I just did it, it's easy to sometimes focus in totally on where they stand against this one guy without realizing that, there's a situation where they can beat this team. Now, I think they lost them. They lose all 3 games to them last year. No, they went 1-2 against them last season. The first game may have been without Embiid. The last 2 games, they really had significant trouble with them. So going into Friday, there's a couple things that we need to ask ourselves. One, what the starting lineup is going to be. Are they going to continue to switch these things around? We have not heard from Nash around what the plan is for the starting lineup. That was actually kept really close to the vest. Even going into the game against Milwaukee, where an hour plus time before the game started, he declined to give who the starters were going to be, waiting until the sort of league mandated 30 minutes before tip to announce that they were going to go with Claxton and Blake as the starters. And I wonder if we're going to get a situation like that. Again, we already saw that the Nets aren't married to certain situations. If they were married to placating veterans or doing things like they did last year, we would have seen Bruce Brown and Blake Griffin start again. They would have just done that. That was the team that basically they went with at the last year, and they did that in the exact matchup against Philly the first time. Bruce Brown was on the team last year. They didn't do that in this first game. Claxton, who kind of was buried for a lot of the preseason, all of a sudden starts in their last tune-up game and then starts the first game of the year. I don't think that's a signal that he's going to start every game from here on out. I think we talked about it yesterday. I think it's more a signal that they plan on experimenting, tinkering, seeing what works, looking at the opposing team, playing some matchups going that way as well, because I think that's the way that they're constructed now. They clearly don't have a set starting 5. They also have some flexibility around how they can play this situation. They gave themselves some outs in terms of who they brought in, and somewhat differing skill sets, especially around some of the bigger bodies that they brought on in the offseason, to give themselves a chance to say, hey, in this game, we're going to start X and Y. In this game, we're going to start, U, V. Well, I'm giving all the letters now. Different players. I shouldn't have even started the letter thing. We're going to give we're going to look at how these combinations work or don't work. We even saw it in the first game besides that, right? We talked about this also, that Paul Millsap and LaMarcus Aldridge came in for that first sort of big line change rotation with a few about halfway through the first quarter. And then when they did that again in the second half, Paul Millsap was nowhere to be found. And so they already showed even in-game willingness to change on the fly around different combinations that they're going to run out for the season. So I think that points to Steve Nash and company clearly having this idea around the team right now, which is we're not married to anything. We're not just going to nominally start players because they were on the team last year or because they started at times and were good last year, i.e. Bruce Brown. We are going to find out what works, and we'll spend the early part of the season doing that. That gets a little thrown into turmoil because there's no Kyrie, so the scoring punch isn't quite what they really probably thought they were going into the season with. But we also knew that bringing back Aldridge, bringing in Millsap, bringing in a guy like James Johnson, having Blake come back, right? These guys that are going to play these 4 and 5 roles, it's nice to bring in all those names without a totally clear understanding of how exactly they were all going to fit together. And that's what we're going to see in this early season. So what do they do against Philly to start this game? I think there's some chance they could go with the same starting lineup. You can run out Claxton and maybe do something with him on Tobias Harris like they did for Chris Middleton. I think that's a totally reasonable approach, and they just live with what they can get with Blake on Embiid, which isn't admittedly not going to be much, but it's not like the other options behind them are so great. You want to start Aldridge, he's going to have the same problems in terms of size that Blake would have. So maybe you think you get a little more scoring punch. Maybe you don't need quite the athleticism around the 4 and the 5 that they needed against Milwaukee when you're dealing with Giannis. Because if you think it's going to be a slightly slower paced game, that the Sixers are going with, especially with Joel, are going to want to get more in the post, I think you could probably live a little bit more with what Aldridge does on that end than they could. That was going to be so problematic against Milwaukee that we even knew from the jump that Aldridge is going to struggle on that. Maybe they try to say, okay, yeah, you're going to get trucked too, but the game will move at a slower pace, so we're not worried about getting up and down the court. We're not going to be as switch heavy probably as they were against Milwaukee, and then you can live with some of what Aldridge can give you on that end also. So maybe we see an Aldridge start. Maybe this is what the Nets do. Maybe they say, like, last game was Claxton, last game was Blake. Hey, now it's going to be Aldridge. Again, I'm speculating because Steve Nash has not come out with the starting lineup yet. Maybe by the time this is all old news, and I look wrong about this, and they just roll with this group of starters. But I guess even if they did that, I would still stand by the point that they definitely don't need to, and I don't think that they're married to any one of these combinations. Then you have a couple other little things with the Sixers that offer some a little weirdness, right? Like, is Ben Simmons going to play? We know Ben Simmons walked out of practice, was basically kicked out of practice by Doc Rivers and company. That situation's a total mess. And by the way, if you want a good if you want a good outline of how not to handle trying to get traded, just go and look at the Ben Simmons situation and just do every single thing that he's done in his camp have done in this situation, and you'll pretty much know how to submarine a situation across the board. It's been an absolute and total mess, just from the holdout to the getting kicked out of practice to not being mentally ready. I'm all for mental health. I just it doesn't all the way line up with all the other stuff that's happened here. So and I'm as pro player as anybody in the world. Believe me, go back and listen to the podcast. I'm probably 100% pro player when it comes to making decisions. I'd eliminate the draft if I could. And I think that's being pro player. Just allow these guys to sign right out of college or high school, wherever they want. So I don't know how to get more pro player than this. And it's so increasingly difficult to defend how Simmons has gone about wanting to exit this situation. So anyway, that's my little missive there. But in terms of, they can run a different starting lineup depending on if Simmons is going to play or not, because he presents unique challenges around how you defend them. I'm not so worried about that right now because that situation's so messy that I don't even see a scenario where they trot him into the starting lineup for this game too. I know there was a 1-game suspension. Maybe they have already said that he was going to sit out some stuff with conditioning and just being team ready. So my guess is he doesn't play. But if he did, that would sort of complicate things on that end a little bit in terms of how they match up. So this is all to say how the Nets run out their starting lineup will be really interesting. I think that Nets fans probably need to start being patient with some of this stuff. We probably need to be patient if it doesn't even look good again around how exactly they are gelling together, because again, this is another tough matchup, and this is just like, this is a very hard matchup right now to start to be experimenting with things. It's one thing if you experiment against the Orlandos and the Houstons and, these bottom feeding, the OKCs, the bottom feeding teams, even the Cavs, who don't project to be very good over the course of the season. Working on experimentation around a guy like Giannis and then a guy like Joel Embiid, it makes the situation difficult and frankly can make it look worse because you're doing it against some of the very best players in the league that have very few weaknesses in their game. And when that's the case, your weaknesses are really going to be exposed. All right, going to close this Friday episode out here in a second. First, going to talk to you about our good friends. I was just going to say friends, but these are good friends at this point over at Built Bar. We talked about these guys for a while. My family still run, family and extended family. When I was away, family went running for the Built Bar boxes when our good friends were able to send us some new samples and even some old favorites. Very best protein bar on the market. Point stop. They started with the flavors, a big mistake from a lot of other protein bar companies. They didn't focus on the flavors, folks, but this is coconut, double chocolate, German chocolate, orange, strawberry, salted caramel, cookies, and cream. Just some of the flavors available for you over at Built Bar. Then you want the metrics, you want the stats, you want the data analytics. You get 17 to 18 grams of protein, calories ranging from 130 to 180, 4 to 5 grams of net carbs, just 4 to 5 grams of grams of sugar. Go to built.com, use the promo code LOCKEDON, just like our podcast network. You get 15% off your order. Use the promo code LOCKEDON for 15% off at built.com. All right, so getting into this final piece about what to expect here from the game against Philly, I want to temper a little bit of expectation still. I hate to be, look, I was a guy who was as bullish on the Nets win total going into the season as anybody around. Believe me, I said they could win upwards of over 60 games. Even I was like, there was worlds where they could push to 70. That was before the Kyrie situation. We talked at length on previous podcasts around where at least my projections changed the sort of the expectation around where the team could land in terms of wins once Kyrie was lost. I got some pushback on that. That's fine by me. I stand by it. I think that it's insane to say that you can lose a guy like Kyrie Irving and not really miss it on the basketball court. Anyone that says the Nets were just gonna move on, I don't really know what else to tell you around that. But I still think the Nets are going to be fine, so I'm not worried about that. And like I said at the top, this is a situation where they get a little bit unlucky in terms of who they have to face early in the season, and I think by some degrees that's just going to make that there's a chance at panic mode, I think, after this game, because I think this game is going to be a tough one. I think there's a world where the Nets don't win this game. Sixers looked really darn good coming out of the gate in their first game of the year, so there's for sure worlds where the Nets just don't win this game. And I want to really caution people. Obviously, this is before it has even happened, so this hasn't happened yet. Okay, everyone can calm down. But I want to caution people about overreacting if the Nets were to start 0-2 here. The Sixers dispatched the Pelicans really, really easily in the first game. They won by 20, didn't have to press anybody into really big minutes. The game was pretty much over by the fourth quarter. They rested starters on the back end, and so kind of away you go. But there's a world where the Nets, no early line, at least by our friends over at BetOnline, has come out for this game. Yet my guess, it's something like Sixers -1. That's again a total guess. I'll take some heat if I'm wrong by that. Maybe Sixers by 1.5, something like that. I could see that being the opening line for where it starts, which give you a good indication. That line will give you a good indication of how sort of worried books are around the situation. Again, I'm not worried from a long haul kind of perspective, but I could see a world where we are sitting here Friday evening, Saturday morning, staring at a Nets 0-2 record, and folks definitely wanting to start doing the Chicken Little Skies Falling piece, because that's just the nature of the business. We know NBA is nothing if not overreaction central. What you see one day is the thing that tells you, I'm being sarcastic, what you see one day is the thing that tells you the future, right? Like, oh, the Nets, this happened with the Nets. So therefore, we need to start freaking out about all the other things that are going to happen. No, I don't think that would be the case even if they were 0-2. I'd like to see some of the pieces that they struggled with in the first game start to get cleaned up, some of the sloppiness, some of the mistiming around different sets. That could still be a problem if they fiddle with the starting lineup again. That stuff doesn't get corrected by continuing to mix and match peaches. Oh boy, mix and match pieces. Say that 5 times fast. I wasn't able to. I got peaches in there somehow. If they're still doing that around their lineups, then I think we could see a couple weeks of this, right? A couple weeks of this tune-up sort of mentality around how things work. And I want to almost get out ahead of that for Nets fans right now in how they view this Sixers game, because I think there's going to be, like you've heard up to this point, the 20 plus minutes we already talked about this. This is a problematic matchup for them. It always has been, and there's nothing that's been done here to really correct that. And that's, again, it's okay. But if we're staring at a Nets 0-2 going into Saturday, I can see a world where people are upset by that, and by where Nets fans, maybe rightfully, probably not, start to get worried about the team's prospect and future. But I think as Nets fans right now, we have to have this sort of patient approach to how we view the team. We have to have a patient approach around how these pieces fit together. I think we need to have a patient approach of how we take a steady hand in our fandom, and how we view the long-term prospects of our team compared to what the actuality is on the court right now, which is they have a bunch of guys who haven't played a ton of basketball together. They need time to sort of figure it out. They unfortunately have to go against 2 of the top 10 worst matchups in the league on an individual basis in terms of Giannis and Embiid in the first 2 games. Two guys that every single team in the NBA struggles with, by the way. Nets have just struggled specifically with Embiid like a little bit more than most in the past. And so I think we just have to say, hey, what are we going to, as a fan, as people that cover the team, is this willing to, whatever happens here, is it willing to change our opinion drastically one way or the other? I would say the same thing goes for if they win, because honestly, even if they win this game, and I think there's a fine chance that they do, I think we have to make sure we don't do the same overreaction the other way, because the stuff that we talked about now is still it would still be a thing whether they won this game or not. There still needs to be lots of on-court time that these guys need to get together to work out. There's lots of reps these guys need in games to figure out what's going to work. There's lots of time on court that we need to see on-off data around what 5-man, 4-man, 3-man combinations are working with this team. And that's just going to take time. We don't have sample size to that. We didn't get enough of Aldridge. We have nothing with Patty Mills, right? We have nothing with Paul Millsap. That takes time. You don't get 5-minute, 10-minute, 15-minute sample sizes around guys playing together and start making long pronouncements about how it's going to work long term. I mean, if they're awesome right away, like you put Kyrie Irving, James Harden, Kevin Durant together, and it's like unbelievable for the first 100 plus minutes, I think you can start to make that's a little different. Those are superstars. It works together. Most times superstars like that, super versatile superstars will work like that. I think you can start making determinations off lower sample sizes. For guys like this that are a little bit more role player-ish, a little bit veteran kind of guys who aren't going to play tons and tons of minutes going forward, at least in like long stretches, you're going to need more of a sample size. We're going to need 10, 15 games, 20 games. The Nets aren't going to be 0-20 in that time, but like we're going to need that time to start fleshing it out. And I think that if the Steve Nash and company and Sean Marks are willing to take this long game approach to what's going to work the best, tinker as much as possible to get large sample sizes out of it, to make sure that they kind of get really good ideas about what works and what doesn't, then we're going to have to live with a little bit of the lumps there. I think we're just going to have to. Kyrie Irving, when he's on the court, when he's on the team, you don't have to live with it as much because you have such an absolute dangerous scoring just group that you can just live with a little bit of things that don't work that well because you score so easily that, okay, your defense isn't as great, your rotations aren't as great, whatever. We're just going to score so many times down the court per 100 possessions that it's not going to end up mattering. They don't have that right now. And so going into this game against the Sixers, I just want to make sure Nets fans stay calm. I don't know if that's going to be people have the ability to do that. I really hope they are able to. I really hope that they're able to look at this put it this way. If the Nets were to lose this game, would you change your priors around how you felt like beginning of the season, if you never watched these games, right? If you never watched what happened in Milwaukee and someone just told you, hey, they started the season 0-2, but I know what they have, you wouldn't freak out. You wouldn't freak out. So sometimes when you watch these things kind of happen in real time is when you start to do it. Now, we're going to talk about it. We'll always keep breaking it down. We'll always kind of slice and dice it as any way we can to see how the Nets can improve, what's working well, what isn't. And that's really what I want to go into Friday looking for, is like what they're going to do, what the plan's going to be, who the starting lineup's going to be, what if that first rotation looks the same. It's not going to, I don't think. What they try to cobble together, what they try to put together in terms of pieces. If we see Durant and Harden play a little bit more together, if they continue to stagger them, I think there's lots of stuff we can look at here. I think there's lots of stuff that we can see how they can, some of the stuff will formulate for the long term in terms of the Nets. And I just want to challenge fans to say, hey, let's just watch the game, enjoy it, see what they do. If the results don't work out here, that's fine. If they do, that's also fine, but let's not freak out one way or the other. All right, thanks for making Locked On Nets your first listen. We are coming at you every single day here on every podcast platform, but also on YouTube. Make sure you go and subscribe to our YouTube channel, seeing really great numbers, getting comments over there. Adam and I respond to every single comment, as long as it's like reasonable. There's been a couple that you can't comment on everything, but if it's not reasonable, but if it's reasonable, hey, positive or negative, we're definitely going to get it in there and comment. So make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Nets YouTube channel. The link will be in the show notes. Adam usually likes to close this off with a quote. I'm not going to do that. I'm not as smart as Adam. I'm not as well read. It's not as easy for me to just go and look for the quotes out here. I'll just say, hey, Nets fans, win or lose Friday night against Joel Embiid, don't freak out. It's all good. It's a long season ahead of us. We'll be here 5 days a week bringing you Nets stuff. Talk to you next week when we talk about more Brooklyn Nets basketball.